Lawrence Pemberton had made a career destroying rock guitarists with his pen. He was the most influential music critic at Rolling Stone magazine, and he despised Kiss. So when he got invited onto the Midnight Special in 1978, he came prepared to humiliate Ace Frehley on live television. His weapon was a classical guitar piece by Francisco Tárrega, so technically demanding that even conservatory graduates struggled with it. He handed Ace the sheet music backstage and said with a cold smile, "Play this if you're really a guitarist." What happened next didn't just wipe the smile off his face. It ended his career the following morning. Before we dive into what happened that night, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we're bringing you the untold stories behind rock and roll's most legendary moments. Lawrence Pemberton wasn't just any critic. He'd studied classical guitar at Berklee. He'd interviewed everyone from Andrés Segovia to John Williams. He considered himself a guardian of legitimate musicianship, which to him meant technical precision, formal training, and respect for the classical tradition. He saw Kiss as everything wrong with rock music. Face paint, pyrotechnics, commercial theatrics, and worst of all, guitarists who he believed couldn't actually play their instruments properly. Ace Frehley represented everything Pemberton hated about the direction popular music had taken in the 70s. Pemberton had written extensively about Kiss, and his reviews were vicious in their contempt. He called Ace Frehley a competent rhythm player at best, someone who hid behind smoke bombs and makeup because he lacked genuine technical ability. He wrote that Ace's solos were sloppy, predictable, and derivative. He claimed that any first-year student at a legitimate music school could play circles around the so-called space ace. These weren't critical assessments. They were character assassinations wrapped in musical terminology, designed to diminish not just Ace's talent, but his legitimacy as a musician. The producers at the Midnight Special knew about Pemberton's hatred for Kiss and Ace Frehley specifically. That's exactly why they invited him as a guest on the same episode where Kiss was scheduled to perform. The show was already one of the highest-rated music programs on television, but this promised something special: controversy, tension, and the possibility of a genuine confrontation between a rock star and his most vocal critic. What those producers didn't realize was that Lawrence Pemberton had no intention of just sitting in the audience and offering his opinion after the performance. He had orchestrated something far more calculated. The episode began normally enough. Host Wolfman Jack did his introduction with his signature growling enthusiasm. Kiss performed 2 songs from their latest album, complete with their full stage show. The pyrotechnics were smaller than their concert productions, limited by television studio regulations, but the energy was undeniable. Ace's solos on both songs were tight, powerful, and exactly what Kiss fans expected. The studio audience, packed with Kiss Army members, went absolutely wild. But cameras kept cutting to Lawrence Pemberton sitting in the VIP section, his expression one of barely concealed disdain. After Kiss's performance, Wolfman Jack brought Lawrence Pemberton onto the stage. The audience's cheers turned to confused murmurs. Most of them had no idea who this serious-looking man in an expensive blazer was, or why he was there. Wolfman introduced him as one of rock music's most respected voices and asked what he thought of what they'd just witnessed. Pemberton didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What I just saw wasn't musicianship," Pemberton said, his voice cutting through the studio. "It was a laser show with a backing track. Mr. Frehley is very good at pointing his guitar at the audience. He's mastered the art of the rock pose. But let's be honest about what we're really discussing here. This is entertainment, not music. This is marketing genius. I'll grant you that. But it's not artistry." The studio went quiet. This wasn't the usual friendly banter between host and guest. This was an attack, and everyone felt it. Wolfman Jack, sensing the tension, tried to redirect, but Pemberton wasn't finished. He leaned forward, addressing the camera directly. You want to know the difference between someone like Ace Frehley and a real guitarist? A real guitarist has studied. They understand music theory. They can read notation. They can play across multiple styles. Mr. Frehley can play power chords and pentatonic scales, which is fine for what he does, but let's not confuse that with actual guitar mastery. That's when he made his move. Pemberton reached into a leather portfolio he'd brought with him and pulled out several pages of sheet music. He walked across the stage to where Ace was standing with the rest of Kiss, still in their full makeup and costumes. The cameras followed every step. This is Recuerdos de la Alhambra by Francisco Tárrega, Pemberton said, holding up the pages. It's a classical piece written in 1899. It requires a technique called tremolo, where the guitarist must play rapid, continuous notes while maintaining a separate melody line. It's considered one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical guitar repertoire. He extended the sheet music toward Ace. If you're truly a guitarist, Mr. Frehley, and not just someone who's learned a few crowd-pleasing tricks, you should be able to sight-read this and perform it right now for everyone watching. The studio audience gasped. Kiss fans started booing. Paul Stanley stepped forward like he was going to intervene, but Ace put a hand on his arm. The cameras zoomed in on Ace's face, though his spaceman makeup made it hard to read his expression. 15 million people watching at home held their breath. This was either going to be a disaster or something nobody expected. You want me to play this right now? Ace asked, his New York accent clear even through the tension. If you can, Pemberton replied with that same condescending smile. But I understand if you'd rather not. There's no shame in admitting you're an entertainer rather than a musician. They're different skill sets. This moment could have gone several ways. Ace could have refused and looked like he was backing down. He could have gotten angry and looked unprofessional. He could have laughed it off and tried to deflect. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone in that studio. I'll play it, Ace said quietly. But I'm going to need a classical guitar. Not this, gesturing to his custom Gibson Les Paul. The producers scrambled. Within minutes, a stagehand brought out a classical nylon string guitar borrowed from one of the show's session musicians. Ace took off his leather gloves, the ones studded with silver that were part of his Space Ace costume. Wolfman Jack looked between Ace and Pemberton, realizing this had become something far bigger than a typical episode segment. What almost nobody knew, what Lawrence Pemberton certainly didn't know, was that Ace Frehley had grown up in the Bronx taking classical guitar lessons. His first teacher was a man named Mr. DiCarlo, an Italian immigrant who'd studied at the conservatory in Milan before moving to New York. Ace's parents, struggling to make ends meet in a working-class neighborhood, had saved money to pay for those lessons because they saw something in their son. A focus, a dedication that appeared whenever he picked up a guitar. Mr. DiCarlo had been strict. He taught Ace proper finger positioning, how to read standard notation, how to play classical pieces by Bach, Sohr, and Tárrega. For 3 years, from age 13 to 16, Ace studied classical technique every Tuesday and Thursday evening in Mr. DiCarlo's small apartment that smelled like espresso and old wood. Ace never talked about those lessons after he joined Kiss. They didn't fit the image. Space Ace was supposed to be a self-taught rock and roll rebel, someone who played by instinct and raw talent. Not someone who'd spent his teenage years practicing arpeggios and studying classical composers. But sitting there on the Midnight Specials stage, holding that classical guitar with Lawrence Pemberton's smirk burning into him and millions of viewers waiting to see him fail, Ace made a decision. He was going to show them what he could actually do. Ace sat down on a stool that had been brought out. He adjusted the guitar, checked the tuning by ear, making small adjustments to several strings. He looked at the sheet music for maybe 30 seconds, his eyes moving across the notation. Then he set the pages aside on the floor next to him. "I don't need to read it while I play," he said simply. "I know this piece." The studio went completely silent. Lawrence Pemberton's smirk faltered for just a moment before returning. He clearly didn't believe Ace, thought this was just bravado before an inevitable failure. Ace closed his eyes, took a breath, and began to play. The opening notes of Recuerdos de la Alhambra filled the studio, and the silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the anticipatory silence of an audience waiting for something to happen. This was the stunned silence of people witnessing something they never imagined possible. The piece requires the guitarist to maintain a constant tremolo effect, where the right hand's ring, middle, and index fingers rapidly alternate on a single string, creating a shimmering, continuous sound while the thumb plays a separate melodic bass line. It's extraordinarily difficult. The two parts have to remain completely independent while working together, like playing two different instruments simultaneously. Ace's technique was flawless. His right hand moved with precision, each note perfectly articulated. His left hand shifted smoothly up and down the fretboard, fingers finding each position without hesitation. But more than the technical execution, there was musicality. He wasn't just playing the notes correctly. He was interpreting them, giving them emotional weight. The tremolo created a haunting, almost ethereal quality, each note flowing into the next like water. The camera operators had stopped following their scripted shots. Every camera was now focused on Ace, trying to capture his hands, his face behind the makeup, the impossible thing happening on that stage. Lawrence Pemberton's expression changed in stages. First, the smirk disappeared. Then his eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly. He looked like a man watching his entire worldview collapse measure by measure. Other musicians in the studio audience, session players and band members who understood what they were hearing, started reacting. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. This wasn't just competent. This was concert-level classical guitar playing from someone they'd been told was just a rock and roll showman. Ace continued through the piece, building toward its most challenging section. There's a passage about 2/3 through where the tremolo must be maintained, while the left hand executes a series of rapid position changes, jumping up and down the neck in ways that would make even experienced classical guitarists nervous. Ace played through it without hesitation, every note clear and precise. His fingers moved so fast they blurred, but the music remained controlled, beautiful, intentional. As he approached the final section, you could see something in his posture. This wasn't just about proving Pemberton wrong anymore. This was personal. This was for Mr. DiCarlo, who'd believed in a kid from the Bronx when everyone else thought classical guitar lessons were a waste of time for someone from that neighborhood. This was for his parents, who'd sacrificed to pay for those lessons. This was for every person who'd dismissed him as just a gimmick, just makeup and pyrotechnics with nothing substantial underneath. When Ace played the final notes, letting them ring out and fade naturally, there was absolute silence for approximately 5 seconds. Then the studio exploded. The audience was on their feet, screaming, applauding. Other musicians were standing, some of them visibly emotional. Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, and Peter Criss were clapping and shouting. Even the camera operators and crew members who were supposed to remain professional were applauding. Wolfman Jack stood there with his mouth open, temporarily speechless, which was remarkable for someone whose entire career was built on never being at a loss for words. The cameras found Lawrence Pemberton. He wasn't applauding. He was sitting completely still, staring at Ace like he was seeing him for the first time. His face had gone pale. His hands were gripping the arms of his chair. Wolfman Jack, recovering his composure, walked over to Pemberton. "Well, Lawrence," he said, drawing out the name. "What do you think now? Does Mr. Frehley qualify as a real guitarist in your book?" Pemberton didn't answer immediately. When he finally stood up, his movements were slow, almost mechanical. He walked across the stage to where Ace was still sitting with the classical guitar. The audience went quiet again, everyone wondering what was about to happen. Confrontation, more criticism, an attempt to save face? What happened next shocked everyone even more than the performance itself. "Mr. Frehley," Pemberton said, and his voice was shaking, "I owe you an apology. Not just an apology. I owe you a profound recognition of my own arrogance and ignorance." He paused, clearly struggling with what he was saying. "I came here tonight believing I understood what makes someone a legitimate musician. I thought I knew the difference between real artistry and commercial entertainment, but I was wrong. I was protecting my own narrow definition of music because it made me feel superior. It made me feel like I had something valuable to protect. But all I was really protecting was my own prejudice." Ace stood up, handed the classical guitar to a stagehand, and faced Pemberton. The contrast was striking. Ace in his full Space Ace makeup and costume, silver studs and black leather. Pemberton in his expensive blazer and dress shirt, every inch the serious music critic. "You don't have to do this," Ace said quietly. "I don't," Pemberton agreed, "but I need to. You're not just a good guitarist. You're an exceptional one. Classical training, rock and roll instinct, technical precision, and emotional depth. I've spent years dismissing you and Kiss as everything wrong with music, and I was completely, fundamentally wrong." He extended his hand. "I'm sorry." Ace shook his hand. The audience erupted again. "Hey, man," Ace said with a slight smile. "We all got our opinions. You didn't know." "No," Pemberton said, firmly. "I should have known. I should have done my research. I should have approached you and your music with curiosity instead of contempt. That's what a real critic does. I failed at my own profession." The show continued for a few more minutes, but that moment was what everyone would remember. When they cut to commercial, Paul Stanley hugged Ace. Gene Simmons was shaking his head with a huge grin. Peter Criss was laughing and slapping Ace on the back. You could hear him saying, "I can't believe you've been hiding that all this time." By the next morning, every major newspaper and music magazine in America was covering the story. The phone lines at the Midnight Specials offices were overwhelmed with people calling about the episode. The clip of Ace playing Recuerdos de la Alhambra became one of the most requested pieces of footage in television history. Classical guitar radio stations started playing recordings of the piece, mentioning Ace's performance. Music schools began using the clip in their classes as an example of how classical technique could coexist with rock and roll artistry. Lawrence Pemberton didn't wait for Rolling Stone to fire him. He resigned the next day. His resignation letter was published in the magazine's next issue, and it was unlike anything the music journalism world had ever seen. "I have spent my career claiming to be an arbiter of musical excellence," he wrote. "In reality, I was an arbiter of my own biases and insecurities. Last night, Ace Frehley taught me that genius doesn't respect the arbitrary boundaries we try to impose on it. He taught me that a musician can be commercially successful and artistically legitimate at the same time. He taught me that makeup and pyrotechnics don't diminish technical ability. They're just different ways of connecting with an audience. Most importantly, he taught me that I stopped being a critic years ago and became a gatekeeper instead, more interested in excluding than understanding. I am not qualified to judge music anymore because I have proven I cannot recognize mastery when it's directly in front of me. I'm grateful to Mr. Frehley for that lesson, even though learning it meant confronting my own failures." The letter became legendary in journalism circles. Critics and journalists referenced it for decades afterward as an example of intellectual honesty and the importance of challenging your own assumptions. Pemberton eventually wrote a book about bias in music criticism, using his experience with Ace as the central case study. He spent years trying to make amends, championing artists he'd previously dismissed, and encouraging younger critics to approach music with openness rather than preconceptions. Ace rarely talked about that performance in interviews. When journalists asked him about it, he'd usually deflect or make a joke. But people close to him said it was one of the proudest moments of his career. Not because he'd humiliated a critic, though he was human enough to find some satisfaction in that, but because he'd honored Mr. DeCarlo's teaching. He'd proven that all those hours in that small apartment in the Bronx hadn't been wasted, that the discipline and technique he'd learned as a teenager were still part of who he was as a musician, even if they stayed hidden most of the time. Mr. DeCarlo, who was in his 70s by then and still teaching guitar in the Bronx, watched the episode live. The next day, reporters tracked him down, wanting to know about the famous rock star who'd been his student. He told them, "Ace was the most dedicated student I ever taught. He understood that classical technique wasn't about limitation, it was about possibility. You master the fundamentals, so you can do anything you want with them." He took those lessons and created something entirely his own. That's what real musicianship is. The performance did something important beyond vindicating Ace personally. It challenged the cultural gatekeeping that insisted rock music and classical music were separate worlds that shouldn't overlap. It proved that commercial success and artistic credibility weren't mutually exclusive. It showed that someone could wear makeup and shoot rockets from their guitar, while also being a technically brilliant musician. The arbitrary lines people drew between legitimate and commercial music started to seem less important after that night. Years later, classical guitarists would cite Ace's performance as inspiration. Rock guitarists would talk about the importance of studying different styles and techniques. Music schools would invite rock musicians to speak alongside classical performers. And Lawrence Pemberton's resignation letter became required reading in journalism programs as a case study in intellectual humility and the dangers of letting bias masquerade as expertise. But the real legacy of that night on the Midnight Special was something simpler and more powerful. A kid from the Bronx who'd been told his whole life that real musicians didn't dress like spacemen or play in rock bands, who'd been dismissed as a gimmick by people who considered themselves serious music authorities, stood on a television stage and proved that talent, real, legitimate talent, couldn't be confined to anyone's narrow categories, that you could honor classical tradition and push musical boundaries at the same time. That mastery showed itself in unexpected places if you were willing to actually look for it instead of assuming you already knew where to find it. Lawrence Pemberton came to the Midnight Special that night, intending to expose Ace Frehley as a fraud. Instead, Ace exposed Pemberton's prejudice for what it really was, not protection of musical standards, but fear of anything that didn't fit into his predetermined boxes. And he did it not with anger or confrontation, but with music. With the same piece that Pemberton had chosen as a weapon, thinking it would reveal Ace's inadequacy. Instead, it revealed everything Lawrence Pemberton had missed by refusing to look past the makeup and the pyrotechnics. Recuerdos de la Alhambra translates to Memories of the Alhambra in English, referring to the famous palace in Spain. On that night in 1978, Ace Frehley created a memory that would last far longer than any critic's dismissive review. A memory of the moment when prejudice met preparation and lost. When assumption met ability and crumbled. When someone who'd been underestimated simply because of how he chose to present himself proved that surface appearance reveals nothing about what lies underneath. And in doing so, he didn't just defend his own reputation. He opened doors for every artist who'd ever been told they had to choose between being commercially successful and being artistically legitimate. He proved you could be both if you had the talent and put in the work. That night, the Space Ace showed everyone that you could reach for the stars while staying grounded in classical fundamentals. And that's a lesson that resonated far beyond rock and roll.